He used to come home late, tired from a world that never gave him time to breathe. Life was a routine of screens, deadlines, and distractions. Faith, prayer, remembrance. Those were things from his childhood, long buried under the weight of adulthood. He wasn't a bad man, just distant from anything that reminded him of Allah. The masjid was something he passed on the way to work but never entered. The Quran sat on a high shelf, untouched for years. To him, religion belonged to old memories and elderly voices. But everything changed one night. Not through a sermon, not through a crisis, but through the quiet voice of his child. It was a normal evening. The father had tucked in his son, turned off the lights, and was about to leave the room when he heard a soft whisper. His son, barely 5, closed his eyes and said, Bismillah. The word was small, but it hit the father like a wave. He paused at the door. Something about the way the child said it, pure, sincere, peaceful, struck a chord deep inside him. He hadn't heard that word in years. Bismillah, in the name of Allah. A word that begins every chapter of the Quran. A word his own mother had taught him before every meal, every journey, every sleep. But somewhere along the road of life, he had forgotten it. And now, here it was again, on the lips of his son. He stood there, frozen in the hallway, heart racing. Tears welled up in his eyes before he could understand why. It wasn't just the word, it was what it carried. A child so small already knew to begin with the name of Allah. What had he taught his child? Had he even spoken about Allah in the house? Had he even said Bismillah himself in years? The realization hit him hard. His son had remembered what he had forgotten. That night, as his son drifted into peaceful sleep, the father walked back to his own room, but sleep did not come. He lay awake, staring at the ceiling, with 1,000 emotions rising inside him. Guilt, shame, longing, hope. He thought about his childhood, the prayers he once prayed beside his father, the Ramadan nights, the stories of the prophets his mother used to share. Where had it all gone? How had life become so busy, so empty of meaning? That one word, Bismillah, had pulled him back to a time when his heart was alive. He realized he missed that feeling. He missed the calm that came after sujood. He missed the peace that came from simply remembering Allah. In the silence of the night, he walked to the shelf where the Quran sat. He dusted it off gently, like it was something sacred, something fragile. And he opened it, not as a scholar, not as a religious man, but as a broken soul seeking light. The verses hit him differently now. They weren't just words. They were answers. He sat for hours, tears falling silently as he read, rediscovering the beauty he had long ignored. By Fajr, he was still awake. This time, he didn't just hear the adhan in the distance, he felt it. And for the first time in years, he stood, bowed, and placed his head on the ground. It wasn't perfect, it wasn't smooth, but it was real. It was sincere. It was a beginning. And it had all started with one word from the lips of a child. Bismillah. He had always seen himself as a good man, responsible, hardworking, present for his family. But deep inside, there was a quiet emptiness he never spoke of. It wasn't depression or sadness. It was more like something was missing, something his heart had once known, but had now forgotten. He couldn't explain it. Life was comfortable, routine, modern. His child had everything, a good education, toys, warmth, love, but still, there was a strange silence in their home when it came to faith. They spoke about school, work, weekend plans, but never about Allah. Not because he didn't believe, but because he didn't feel connected anymore. Religion felt like a dusty book he had closed years ago and never dared to reopen. That night, when his child whispered Bismillah before sleeping, it felt like a storm of memories struck him all at once. He stood there, stunned, listening to a word so familiar yet so distant. It wasn't the first time he had heard it, but it was the first time it felt like it reached his heart. Bismillah, his son said gently, closing his little eyes in peace. It wasn't rehearsed or forced, it was natural. And that's what broke him. His child had learned this not because of him, but despite him. Somewhere, somehow, his young son had picked up something that he himself had abandoned. And that realization shattered his pride. He felt like a stranger in his own home, not because anyone had pushed him out, but because he had quietly removed himself from the circle of remembrance without even noticing. He hadn't taught his son that word. He hadn't reminded him to begin with Allah's name. He had been too caught up in work, comfort, and the illusion of a self-sufficient life. But now, the simplicity of that moment made him feel bare, exposed before his Creator. A child's whisper had brought him to his knees, not with fear, but with humility. He walked out of the room that night carrying something he hadn't felt in years. Longing. Not just for religion, but for Allah, for meaning, for peace. And it all began not with a tragedy, not with a sermon, but with one sincere word from a pure heart. Bismillah. He sat alone in the living room that night, long after everyone had gone to sleep. The lights were dim, the house was quiet, but his mind wasn't. His child's whisper, Bismillah, kept echoing in his ears. That small word had awakened something deep inside him. It wasn't just a memory, it was a reminder of who he used to be and how far he had drifted. He remembered being a child himself, placing his little palms together before every meal and saying, Bismillah. He remembered the warm voice of his mother, gently reminding him to begin everything with Allah's name. And he remembered how it felt back then, safe, centered, full of meaning. But somewhere between growing up, chasing the world, and trying to make it, that connection had slipped away. He wasn't angry at Allah. He wasn't even denying his existence. He had just put that part of his life on silent mode. It wasn't intentional, it was slow and subtle. First, he skipped a prayer or two. Then he stopped opening the Quran. Then it became easier to miss Jummah. Eventually, faith became a background idea, respected but ignored. But that night, something changed. It wasn't a lecture that reached him. It wasn't a crisis. It was a whisper from a child who still believed in starting with Allah. That whisper shattered years of forgetfulness. He picked up his phone and searched the meaning of Bismillah. He already knew what it meant, but this time he wanted to feel it. In the name of Allah, the most merciful, the most compassionate. It sounded like a door he hadn't opened in years. He closed his eyes and whispered it to himself, not loudly, just enough for his own heart to hear. And for the first time in a long time, he felt something move inside him. Peace, humility, softness. That night, he prayed, not out of habit, but from longing. It wasn't perfect. It wasn't long, but it was real. And that one prayer became the first of many. All because a child remembered a word that the father had forgotten. A word that rebuilt a broken connection. A word that brought a man back to Allah. He watched his son sleep, peaceful and still. The word Bismillah still lingering in the air like a soft fragrance. It echoed in his heart with a power he couldn't explain. How could one word, uttered so gently by a child, stir so much within him? That night he realized something profound. Faith is not taught by lectures alone, but often by quiet sincerity. He had spent years building a future for his family, working hard, chasing success, giving comfort. But somewhere along the way, he had stopped building the inner home. The spiritual space where Allah is remembered, where hearts soften, and where peace truly lives. It wasn't that he didn't believe in God. He did. He always had. But belief without remembrance is like a heart without a pulse. Lifeless, dry. And when his son whispered Bismillah, it wasn't just a word. It was a reflection of a home that still carried the light of faith, even if dim. And that light hadn't come from him. It had come despite him. Maybe from a school teacher, maybe from the child's mother, maybe from the fitra, the natural purity Allah places in every child. But the realization that his son carried more awareness of Allah than he did, that truth crushed his ego and awakened his soul. He began thinking about all the ways he had been absent, not physically, but spiritually. He provided food, clothes, safety. But did he provide remembrance of Allah? Did he speak of gratitude, prayer, or purpose? The silence in his home regarding Deen wasn't just a missing piece. It was the very root of the emptiness he often felt, but never admitted. And yet, it only took one word, spoken innocently by his son, to remind him what truly mattered. That night became a turning point. He didn't become a scholar overnight. He didn't suddenly change everything. But he made one firm decision, to never let his home be without the name of Allah again. He began with small steps, saying Bismillah before meals, turning off music during drives, listening to Quran with his son before bed. The atmosphere of the house changed, lightness returned, and all of it began with a whisper, not from a scholar's mouth, not from a dramatic moment, but from the pure heart of a child who still remembered to begin with Bismillah. He sat in the dark, his back against the cold wall, as silent tears ran down his face. The room was quiet, but inside him a storm was raging. It wasn't sadness from loss or pain. It was something deeper. It was the weight of realization, the echo of years that had passed without a single sincere moment with Allah. All it took to awaken that storm was one word, Bismillah. His child had whispered it so softly, so naturally, as if it was the most obvious thing to say before sleep. But for him, it was a spiritual thunderclap. How could something so small feel so heavy? How could one word make him feel both ashamed and hopeful at the same time? He thought about all the nights he had spent on his phone, scrolling mindlessly. The nights wasted binge-watching shows, arguing online, or simply drowning in work and noise. And here was his child, so young, yet already beginning to remember Allah. What had happened to him? Where had he lost the sweetness of faith? He remembered praying when he was young. He remembered his father's calm voice in the masjid, the way his mother used to remind him to say Bismillah before eating, sleeping, or studying. Back then, those words felt like part of life, part of home. But somewhere along the journey, they became relics of the past, things he never denied, but simply didn't carry forward. Now, sitting alone in that moment of raw clarity, he realized something powerful. He had let the world steal his remembrance. Not because the world was stronger, but because he had stopped guarding his soul. He had armored himself with logic, routine, and excuses, but none of them could protect him from the truth that had just hit him. His child's whisper had broken all those walls. And yet, in that heartbreak, there was beauty. Because it wasn't too late. His heart still responded. His tears still fell. He still felt the pull of Allah's mercy. That night, he didn't just cry out of regret. He cried out of yearning. He wanted to come back. He wanted to say, Bismillah, and mean it. And in that quiet corner of his soul, the journey back to Allah had already begun. He woke up the next morning with a strange calm in his chest. The heaviness from the night before hadn't disappeared, but it had transformed into something softer, something more hopeful. For the first time in years, he sat on the edge of his bed and said, Bismillah, before standing. It felt awkward at first, almost foreign on his lips, but the more he whispered it, the more natural it became. That one word, which his son had said with such ease, was now opening doors inside him that had long been locked. It was as if a tiny light had been switched on in a dark hallway, and suddenly he could see where to walk. At breakfast, he looked at his son differently, not just as a child, but as a mirror, a reflection of something pure, something still untouched by the chaos of the world. He watched him eat, his small hands carefully holding the spoon, his innocent eyes occasionally lighting up with small thoughts only a child could carry. And before taking the first bite, his son whispered again, Bismillah. This time, the father didn't cry. He smiled. He said it too Together, they shared the name of Allah at their table, and it felt like home for the first time in years. Later that day, he found himself scrolling through old photos, not of vacations or celebrations, but of the few moments when faith was still part of their home. A blurry picture of a prayer rug, a Quran resting on a shelf, his son wearing a tiny kufi, once gifted by a relative. Those memories weren't dead. They were waiting to be revived. He started reading again, slowly, a page a day from the Quran. He didn't understand everything, but he understood enough to feel. Every verse felt like it was speaking to him directly. About returning, about mercy, about not giving up. He didn't make grand promises or post about it online. His change was silent, gentle, real. He prayed once a day, then twice. He began to say Alhamdulillah more, even for small things. Life didn't change overnight, but something far more important did. His heart began to beat again with the rhythm of faith. And it all started with Bismillah. He used to believe that spiritual transformation required some grand, dramatic event, a tragedy, a miracle, or a moment so overwhelming that it would leave no choice but to change. But his journey didn't begin with any of that. It began with a whisper, just one simple word from his child, Bismillah. That word became a key that unlocked everything. It wasn't spoken with fanfare or drama. It wasn't shouted from a stage or declared in a speech. It was a child's natural habit, built from innocence, love, and pure fitra. And that soft, quiet act held more power than 1,000 sermons. He realized that guidance doesn't always come with lightning. Sometimes it comes in the gentle drop of a word, falling on a heart finally ready to feel. That word followed him everywhere after that night. Before starting his car, Bismillah. Before sending an email, Bismillah. Before taking a sip of water, Bismillah. He began to remember Allah in moments he used to forget. And the more he said it, the more grounded he felt. It wasn't just about saying it, it was about what it meant. Beginning with Allah, relying on Allah, inviting Allah into every part of life. His transformation was not instant, but it was consistent. What started with a word became a routine, then a habit, and finally, a return. He started praying again. He would hear the adhan and feel it in his soul. He would stand in prayer, imperfect but present, not because someone told him to, but because he missed the connection. His relationship with his son grew deeper too. They began praying together, reading together, learning together. It was a bond built not just through love, but through shared purpose. And he understood something he had never fully grasped before. One sincere word with Allah is more powerful than 1,000 wasted words without him. A child's whisper had brought him back to his Creator. It reminded him that faith doesn't always roar, it often whispers. And when the heart is open, even a whisper is enough. That's the beauty of guidance. It finds you, even in the smallest moment, and it always begins with Bismillah. In the end, it wasn't a lecture, a book, or a crisis that brought him back. It was a single word from the lips of a child. Bismillah. That whisper opened the doors of his heart, softened the layers of forgetfulness, and led him gently back to Allah. It reminded him that guidance often begins in silence, in innocence, in the simple moments we overlook. His journey to reconnect with faith wasn't loud, but it was sincere. And sometimes that is all Allah asks of us. A heart willing to return, even if the first step is as small as a whispered Bismillah. Thank you for watching this heartfelt story. If it touched your soul, please like, share, and subscribe. Maybe your one share could be someone else's moment of awakening. And remember, never underestimate the power of a sincere word. It could change a life. Bismillah.